All right, it is time for the burning platform this morning. As it is every Thursday, we check in on all the big stories in the news. We check in on current affairs. We talk about the people, the places, the things, the economy, the society, the politics. And Phumi Mashiko is here with me this morning. Look at Phumi Mashiko, empty chair. No, here's Phumi Mashiko. There she is. There she is. We're still trying to figure out these cameras, and Kanthan is meant to be in that empty chair.
That empty chair.
Oh, there he is.
Aha.
Okay. All right. Let me show you this. I can do this properly. There's your chair. You can go and sit in it. I'll introduce you to our guest in just a moment. Kanthan has appeared all in black, as is per usual.
Now,
Very good.
now right next to me, I can
Yeah.
punch you.
Yeah, exactly. They can lash out at each other. Yeah. All right. So we got lots to talk about this morning, and there's always plenty to talk about. There's never a dull week in South Africa. We're back to cholera, the age of cholera. I mean, it's just so embarrassing and upsetting, but we'll talk about that in a moment or two. We've also got an author here who I'm very excited to have on the show, and somebody whose work is well known to many South Africans, certainly literate ones. Jonny Steinberg is the author of several books about everyday life in the wake of South Africa's transition to democracy. He's a two-time winner of the Sunday Times Alan Paton Award. And Phumi, you said there was a nice spread in the Sunday Times this week.
They like
on the new
you.
book. An inaugural winner of the Donald Wyndham Sandy M. Campbell Literature Prizes. Also, until 2020, was Professor of African Studies at Oxford University, no less. He currently teaches part-time at the Council on African Studies at Yale. Isn't that incredible? At the Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies, and is a visiting professor at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research in Johannesburg. The reason we've got him here is because he has written an amazing book called Winnie and Nelson, and it is all about the marriage of Nelson and Winnie Mandela. And obviously, there are plenty of things to unpack there, so we won't waste any time. Jonny, it's very, very nice to have you here. Thank you for coming. Good to see you. Yeah. So first things first, congratulations on the book. I mean, it must have been a hell of a project.
It was a very exciting project. It was 3.5 to 4 years of full-time work, and I loved every moment of it. It was a journey of discovery.
So, I mean, COVID helped, right, in terms of time and research?
COVID helped. I was locked away with nothing else to do, day in and day out.
My God. All right. And in terms of this is a monster, mammoth project to undertake because there are so many chapters and there's so many aspects to this relationship. And in so many ways, I think it made South Africa an even more interesting place. I mean, on their own, Nelson and Winnie are quite something, but to look at them as part of a collective, to actually observe them from their early romance into their political union, into their separation, the fact that they were so, distant from each other and so incapable of being around each other all the time. And then there was the little bit of time that they had with each other. And then, of course, post-freedom. What's going on there, Kanthan? What are you doing? You are being such a disruptor this morning.
So disruptive. Like WhatsApp coming in and out.
Phumi keeps poking me from the
Phumi.
side.
Who the hell is Dumi?
Dumi.
And he brought an imaginary
Ryan,
friend.
get in here and just turn this thing
your
of Kanthan's
ears
off.
that are wrong.
Jesus, I don't know why I'm having to hear everything in echo. I'm trying to introduce our guest and we're messing
Help
around.
Kanthan, please.
Just turn his sound off there. Thank you. Oh my God. Is that all it took? One tap from Ryan. So Jonny, as I was saying,
That's why he gets the big bucks.
so the marriage is one aspect to this, but then there's this divorce at the end, and a very bitter and acrimonious one at that, and very public. And of course, all of Winnie's shenanigans, both pre and post divorce, which are worth discussing too. There's an absolute smorgasbord of material here.
But to go back what you were saying at the beginning, a book about a marriage and a country.
Mm-hmm.
They really, the two protagonists, Nelson and Winnie Mandela, lead me there because they very self-consciously wanted their marriage to embody a struggle for freedom. They wanted the whole country's story to be told through their marriage. From the earliest days, they were beautiful. They liked cameras. They were ambitious. They understood that their marriage was a political asset, and that you could tell a freedom struggle through the relationship between them. And really, they were right. I mean, that marriage in the 1980s was probably the most famous marriage in the world, and it was inseparable from South Africa's struggle for freedom. And it was such a simple story. It's that this wonderful couple has been torn asunder. One of them is in prison, the other is banished. And the day they get back together is the day their people are free. And so the story of a marriage and the story of a people become one. Sure. They put it out there like that, and they succeeded. But with a twist in the tail, they lost control over the story. They lost control over the story of what their marriage was and what their country was. And to write a book about them, that's a gift, because you can, you know, a writer's always looking for a frame, for something that contained a big story. And that marriage really does contain a big story. It's about two huge, larger-than-life people, but it's about a country over the course of a century. And that marriage allows you to take in that expanse of you know, that bigger story.
What do you mean they lost control of the story?
Well, one of the things that happened is that while Nelson Mandela was in prison, he and Winnie grew politically estranged, but in a very strange way, because Nelson didn't know for a long time. You know, when you're locked up in jail, you lose touch with many things, including what's happening in your wife's head and your wife's life. But by the 1980s...
And in her bed.
Well, that's another story we can get to.
I mean,
we have to. That's the part of the salacious gossip I'm here for.
We will definitely get there.
I'm only here for the salacious gossip.
But before we get there, by the 1980s, Nelson Mandela's greatest fear was that his country would descend into civil war, because he felt that if there was war, South Africa would never recover from it. And he felt that his responsibility as a political leader was to ensure that there was going to be a negotiated settlement. Winnie Mandela by then felt the exact opposite. She felt that unless apartheid ended through a violent mass insurrection, it would not end at all. And one of the things I talk about in the book is that behind his back, while going to see him in prison and playing the loyal wife, she is actually attempting an armed insurrection. And he realizes this very late in the day. He realizes late in the day that his worst fear, his worst nightmare is in his marriage. And so this marriage becomes much more interesting, much more dangerous, much more complicated than either of them imagined at the beginning.
What a fascinating way to start this discussion, because there's so many different places it can go. The fact that they're also such different personalities, I think is fascinating. You also said that it wouldn't be the first, I mean, I'm surmising, it wouldn't be the first political union. There have been throughout history powerful people who have come together, men and women who've decided to put their political ambitions ahead of their own romantic ones. And there seems to be a lot of naivety around the fact that Winnie and Nelson were this loving couple. And they seem to also, you know, people are doing revisionist history on this and saying, oh, well, you know, it was this beautiful story. But then, of course, all the difficulties of being in South Africa and during the struggle and all of that stuff, that was the real problem. That was what made their marriage fall apart. But actually, as you say, it was from within.
Well, I mean, the story of their courtship is amazing, really. She was... you know, she was young. She was 20 years old. He was 38 years old. He was nearly twice her age. He was a very famous lawyer, a very famous political activist, a very glamorous man. He wore bespoke suits. He drove a fancy car. He was very flashy. He was married with 3 children, but was a notorious womanizer. I mean, Johannesburg discussed his sex life endlessly. He was driving past Baragwanath Hospital, where he saw this stunningly beautiful girl waiting for a bus, and said that he was so taken that he wanted to turn his car around and go back. But instead what he did is found out who she was and get her phone number. And so begins their story. And her side of the story is she was an extraordinary, extraordinary young woman. I mean, besides being stunningly beautiful, she was a woman in the 1950s who knew from a young age that she wanted to be a public figure and a political figure and to exercise power. And how do you do that as a woman in the 1950s? You've got to take the resources you have. And a resource she had was her beauty and her charisma and her sexuality, and she used that. And so while she was engaged to Nelson Mandela, she was engaged to another man called Barney Sampson. She'd promised both of those she was going to marry them. And she played them off each other, but in a way
Cleopatra and Antony and you know, I mean, that's what it is. It's Julius Caesar and it's this incredible woman who realized her gifts and deployed them,
but took herself to the edge of distraction. The edge of unacceptability. So one of the things that she did is, so she stayed in this very austere Methodist hostel where you weren't allowed male visitors. So she would see Nelson in his office in Chancellor House, his law office, in the evenings. But when he would go out to the boxing gym, which he did every evening, leaving her there, she would immediately see her other lover in his office. She was really scandalous. And Nelson Mandela.
So right from the start, there's no loyalty here.
Well, that's not the way I see it. The way I see it is that they're both
pursuing their own agendas.
They're very exuberant, exciting people. And Nelson Mandela is absolutely in love with this audacity. He thinks it's extraordinary. And
it is.
He's throughout the 1950s, he goes for powerful women. And Winnie is the most powerful he's met. So they are very in love. What's happening between them is very electric. They are deeply attracted to each other. But attraction's a complicated thing, and I think part of the attraction is that they understand what they're going to look like together in public. You know, they're both very, very ambitious people. They understand that their marriage is going to be a thing, and it can be a political thing. They know that from the start.
Sure. I mean, what an intro. Listen, you read the book and the hair on the back of your neck stands up. It's absolutely astonishing. You've got something to say.
Well, I do also want to ask about your source material and research and how you went about that to getting to the story that you eventually tell.
So it's a long story over a long period of time. So there are different sources at different points. But let me just talk about two for now. So that story of their courtship and how dangerous it was, how on the edge of unacceptable it was. The only
dangerous liaisons. Told you I'm here for the salacious.
The only reason we know that story is that Nelson Mandela was locked up in jail years later and wrote to his wife about it. They would never have spoken about it openly if he hadn't been in jail. And the reason why he spoke so honestly about it was because here he was locked up. When he was on the outside, he didn't know what was going on with her. He was so afraid of losing her. And the only way he had of keeping her was through his letters to remind her how exciting things had been. You know, they were together such a short time. They met in 1957. They married in 58. By 1961, he was underground. So there are these 4 short years. And for him, his life is embodied in those 4 years. And he's trying to preserve them in prison and trying to take her along for the ride, to get her to remember what it was like. And so he tells her, he reminds her in these letters of these unacceptable things that happened between them, just to keep her excitement up, to maintain the love between them.
Can I just ask you quickly, was it always the plan to wait until they were both gone? Because you couldn't write this kind of thing while they were alive. And were there any people who didn't want to talk to you about this?
Yeah, this book is impossible to write while they're alive. You know, when I began writing this book, the idea was to write a book on Nelson Mandela rather than his marriage. And the reason was that now that he was dead, I felt that it was possible for the first time to write about him as a rounded human being with his frailties, with the dark side, with everything. That if you'd done it while he was alive, it would have been an attack on him,
sure,
and maybe even an attack on the South African project.
And I think people would have been upset about any portrayal of Winnie that wasn't saintly. At some point, just before she died, people were treating her with kid gloves in certain quarters.
Well, there was these two opposites. Either people treated her with kid gloves, or they demonized her. You know, she was either a goddess or the devil. And I think that both of those don't get her story. That it's much more
they're both very. It's a very binary way of looking at a very complex woman.
Yeah,
and you know, and there is also some talk in your book about the forces that were anti-Winnie, at least in her mind, and to a large extent, even within the organization, who saw the rise of her political kind of power, as it were, and tried to thwart it along the way. And some of those people, including a former president, cannot possibly be happy that you've written this story in this way.
Well, it's interesting that you raised that. So I think it's important to tell that story from the beginning, because it really gives an insight into what an incredibly complicated person Winnie was. So in the early 1960s, Nelson Mandela went underground. He was caught. He was put on trial. There was the famous Rivonia trial. While that was happening, being a really patriarchal man, he thought, I'm gone. I need to find a man to look after my wife and children. And so he approaches a distant relative of his, a man called Brian Samana, and instructs him to look after his wife and children. And within a short time, Brian Samana and Winnie are lovers. And Winnie invites Brian Samana, asks him to leave his own wife and children and move into the house that she shared with Nelson Mandela, which scandalizes the movement. They can't believe that she's doing this, but it goes on. And then it turns out that Brian Samana is in fact a police informer. And two men go to jail as a result of him. Fikile Mbalula arrives on Robben Island screaming at Nelson Mandela, saying, look at what your wife has done to me. And at that point, a delegation goes to her and says, you have to leave this man. We are telling you to leave this man. And she says, nobody tells me what to do. I'm staying with him. She was a very complicated person. She had no sense of self-preservation. That episode nearly destroyed her. It shaped her life in the 1960s. It made her isolated. It indirectly...
Do you think she was a bad judge of character?
I think that what happened with her is, to go back to her childhood, she was one of 11 children. She was in a massively ambitious family. What her family had done over the last 2 generations was extraordinary. They wanted the next generation to go even further. She had parents who picked winners and losers. And she understood that if she was a loser, she would evaporate. She'd be nothing. She had to be a winner. It was a very, very tough world to grow up in. Sure. And she also understood from a young age that to be a winner, she had to be inside her father's head and determine what was happening there. She needed to occupy space in somebody else's mental world. And she did with her father. She became his prodigal son. He invested more in her than his sons. And it's something that he'd never imagined that he would do. So she had this, just from a very tough childhood, she developed this power. But the downside of that power, the flip side of it, is that she could never be alone, not physically, but also not mentally and emotionally. She had to be in a boundaryless relation with another, as she was with her father when she was young. And so if you look at her political career, she is always moving into politics in a consuming sexual relationship with somebody else, always, at every moment in her long career. And Brian Samana is the first of many. They were literally inseparable for a few years.
Wow.
And so when she was told, leave this man, she couldn't. She was bound to him. She moved through the world with that sort of intensity.
You're looking very enthralled by this story, but I mean, a lot of it already.
Yeah, but it's fascinating actually listening to it from your perspective and the very human insights that you're giving. My perspective on Winnie has always been very blatantly antagonistic towards her, Gareth. And
yeah,
as you know from the very harsh things I had to say about her on Twitter, and her Ben 10, as in Dali Mpofu. And the very personal point of antagonism for me was the murder of Dr. Abu Aswat, who was a great friend of mine. And it's very clear to just about everyone that Winnie's role in terms of his murder was absolutely pivotal. And, so this idea of complexity at the same time being someone who actually conspires to assassinate someone who is in fact being close to you and close to the movement. How do you actually reconcile that stuff?
So I completely understand your deep anger, given where you come from. My position is different. I'm taking in the whole of an 80-year life. And for me, as a writer of that life and of a marriage in it, to reduce the whole life to what happened in the late 1980s is wrong. There's so much else there, and there is an extraordinary woman there. But
just give us a sense of where that comes from in terms of the overall story arc that we're talking about.
Well,
I think he's being very calm.
Give him a chance.
Go on.
Phumi, stop interrupting.
So I don't sugarcoat what happened in the late 1980s. I tell the story, and it's a horrific story. The murder you're talking about is one of several. But what I try to do is shed some light on what was going on in that household, on why it became such a crazy household. And it's a long and complicated story, and it's probably better told in the book. But one of the things that was so, Winnie and her football team, lived in this house in Orlando West, and it was a very unruly space and an undisciplined space. And within a short period of time, people in that household had committed several murders. And the result is that Winnie was never investigated, never touched, never questioned by the police, but members of her household were. They were taken into detention, and many became informers. And by 1987, nobody in that household knew who anyone else in that household was or who they were working for. It was part of its chaos, and it kind of develops its own psychology as a collective organism, and a crazy, dark, difficult psychology.
There's been so much paranoia and suspicion.
And at various points, it needed to find an external enemy in order to draw attention away from itself. And that's kind of what happened in the famous incident where four young men, well, 3 young men and a child, were kidnapped from a Methodist manse down the road. It was this household, for its very survival, turning its attention on another household, finding evil there in order to distract attention from its own darkness, its own. It was really collapsing in a state of paranoia at that time.
Jeez, so what a story.
You were also talking earlier about how this book is also a study on the South African landscape and a project, as it were. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so many things to say, but let me just focus on one. A really sad aspect of Nelson Mandela's story is, by the 1980s, he was quite a remorseful man. He didn't like the life that he'd lived in the 1950s. He saw his children's lives, and he didn't like what he saw. A lot of them were going wrong. A lot of them were ruined. He believed that it was his fault because he hadn't looked after them properly in the 1950s. And attached to the sadness about his family and the desperate attempt to do something to put it right was a sadness about his country. He was terrified of civil war. He was absolutely convinced that if South Africa descended into war, it would never come out again. It would just take generations to recover. And he wanted to avoid that more than anything else. And yet he was in jail and isolated and increasingly out of touch. And I think that what he didn't know is that what he feared most was already happening. And to an extent, it already happened. The insurrections of the 1980s was a dreadful, dreadful time. I don't think South Africa has quite come to terms with it. And a great irony is that insurrection had eaten its way into the heart of his family, and he didn't know. What was happening in his house in Soweto. The extent to which violent death visited his house in Soweto, the extent to which it was a center and an emblem of the extent to which things were falling apart. He didn't know that until he didn't ever know that, really. I don't think he could ever admit to himself exactly what had happened. And so, this couple begins beautiful and young and attractive and very ambitiously want to embody a nation's story and their story. And it does, but in such an uncomfortable way.
Can we just fast forward quickly? A lot of people are saying, this is a burning platform, and we talk normally about current affairs and politics, but really this is an opportunity for us to just dig deep into such a pivotal relationship in South Africa's political past. And I can't help thinking that for most people, all of this is ancient history up to the moment where he's released. And then their relationship has to resume in some way. And this is the part that I think is most interesting, because we all remember headlines, we remember the pictures, we remember the overall story of South Africa post-94, obviously, when he was president. But Winnie's story kind of goes underground a little bit there, like his went underground in the 60s. And it only emerges again once he's gone, where she appears as the loyal wife again, not the primary wife, but the next wife at the funeral. And for many people, the abiding memory of Winnie is this older lady who is mostly quiet and mostly doesn't say very much. And I mean, come on, towards the end, she didn't.
No, but
it was better for her that she didn't say much.
I don't know if her story goes underground, because there are many moments in the years, even as they were estranged and then divorced, that she keeps popping up, right? I think about her very famous slapping incident with Thabo Mbeki, and all of those moments where Winnie never quite disappeared into the ex-wife of this amazing person.
How do you characterize
I think towards the end of her life, her star rises again among young people. And it does because she retells the story of her marriage. She's continually retelling the story of her marriage. She's so good at it. And the last story she tells before she dies, in the last sort of 6 or 7 years of her life, she says Nelson Mandela was locked away from the experience of being a Black South African. I mean, she puts it as bluntly as that. She says, they treated my husband like with cotton wool. He didn't know what we were going through. And by the time he was released from prison, he wasn't the same Nelson Mandela. He was no longer the embodiment or the representative of his people. Whereas I was in the cauldrons. I was facing the fire. I am the embodiment of Black experience in the late 20th century. I experienced it all. And if I had been in charge in the early 1990s, we wouldn't have compromised. We would have fought on. And so she takes this marriage, she takes their dual experiences, and she turns it into a potent and volatile political story. And for a young generation now who were not born when apartheid ended, who were not born when this couple separated, but who are very disillusioned with the current order, it's a very powerful story. And you know, that's why she is now an iconic figure, you know, in the populist left. She was a genius storyteller. Her antennae was so fine. She knew what was going on around her and how to place herself in what was going on around her.
Well, I mean, Tula says in the comments here that we love Winnie. We're celebrating her holistically with her flaws, her losses, and her winnings. She became what she was because of oppression, and she came out a winner. Pablo says, Winnie was the backbone of the ANC. Stop profiting off bullshit now that they're gone. I mean, these are the...
There's another, you know, Winnie was a disgusting terrorist.
Oh, yeah, there we go.
You know, so the polar views persist.
I mean, you would have wanted, you know, you would have had people who wanted a hagiography here more than a...
I mean, the point of the book was to slip into neither of those polar views. It really would have ruined the book. She's too complicated to tell a simple story about.
So tell me about where it all started falling apart in their relationship, because that to me is the crucial bit that we miss, because Nelson was so busy. He was becoming president. He was already president at a certain point. And then he just turned off the taps and completely disengaged from her. What happened there? Things
started falling apart slowly and invisibly while he was in prison, because
really?
you can't maintain a relationship for 27 years when you can't see one another. It's just not possible. So it's sad. You know, what was happening in his mind was he understood that his life had been broken by prison. You know, and it's hard to get your head around because he's becoming famous, he's becoming politically powerful, but he understands at every moment that isn't a substitute for a human life. And he's trying to gather who he was before he went to jail, because that's all he had. You know, and what he had was Winnie and their kids. And in his mind, and you can see through his letters, his sense of her is becoming more and more idealized. It's no longer a human being in his mind, it's a fantasy. And you can see it's a fantasy in quite disturbing ways, because in the same letter, he'll start a letter describing her as this 20-year-old beauty that he met. And by the end of the letter, suddenly she's a 55-year-old woman and thinking of old age. Time is scrambled in his head. So he's more and more in love with her. She's more and more the center of his identity, but he's actually lost touch with who she is. And she can see this. She's on the outside living a life. You know, she's developed her own political identity. She has had several lovers. She has lived an adult life. And she sees what's going on with him, that he actually no longer knows who she is. She understands pretty early on how hollowed out the marriage has become. But then he's released from prison. And what they both want from the marriage is just completely polar opposites. She no longer has any respect for his politics. She has contempt for his politics by now. She really does. She's certainly not attracted to him anymore. He's frozen in time. He's an old gentleman from the 1950s. She doesn't like that very much. But the marriage to him is her greatest political asset, and she wants to keep it. Whereas for him, he believes that they both have an obligation to try and resume the relationship they had 27 years earlier. And that's what he expects from her. And she will absolutely not give that to him. You know, she has another lover and she doesn't hide it. And she ends up humiliating him. You know,
cuckolding him.
Some very difficult stuff happens in the early 90s. He's newly a very powerful man. His own psychological foundations by now are pretty fragile. And he begins to use his political power to try and put his marriage back together in ways that are quite uncomfortable. And so, for instance, at her kidnapping trial, a couple of her co-defendants and witness disappear, you know, the night before the trial has begun. He didn't order that personally, but people around him did. He did other stuff. He, you know, he squeezed money from international organizations to fund her trial. You know, when the Orlando West branch of the ANC did not even vote her onto the executive because of the Stompie affair, he summoned the leadership to create a new branch for her.
Wow.
And so she could become its chairman. So it's a very difficult moment where he is, you know, he is Nelson Mandela, he's famous, but he's also been a prisoner for 27 years and is trying to find his feet, trying to find out what his life is about. And there's just this moment where he confuses the personal and the political. He uses this political power to try and mend his personal life. And it's never going to work. His marriage is over, really.
I thought you were.
I wanted to find out whether you touched on Mandela's testimony at his divorce trial and whether you used that in the book.
You know,
the very interesting thing at the time was it was the first time that mainstream media in South Africa collectively broke the law and published his testimony at his trial. You know, I disagreed with that at the time. I thought that, you know, the strictures of the Divorce Act, which say that you shouldn't be publicizing stuff that goes on in divorce court. But he said powerful stuff there. And did you touch on that? And
I decided to end the main narrative of the book when they separated in 1992. And the reason was, the book was long. And I felt that is really the moment that the marriage ended, and the book is about the marriage. So the nuts and bolts day-to-day narrative ends in 1992, and then there's an epilogue which sort of races through the next 20 years, where I had a couple of things to say. So I think it was a difficult decision not to go into the 96 divorce, but I think it would have ruined the rhythm of the book. I think that it said what it needed to say.
Or maybe it's for a sequel.
Yeah, I'm sure there'll be plenty of appetite for that. Well, Jonny, I really appreciate you coming in to see us this morning, and I wish you well with the book. I'm sure it's going to be a runaway success. This is still one of those relationships, and people love a story with all the different little touch points in it. You've got rich material here. You've got amazingly interesting people, complex people, and you've done a tremendous job of researching the hell out of this too. So thank you for informing all of us. I mean, we're just thrilled to have had the chance to talk to you.
Thanks for having me. It's been very good to be here.
What a pleasure. Jonny Steinberg, everybody. And the book is called Nelson and Winnie. You can obviously find it at good bookstores. Winnie and Nelson. Let me just get that right. And you can hear all about all good bookstores, and even the bad ones.
And online.
Right? Exactly. All right. Very, very good. Thank you very much, Jonny. And we've got the burning platform still to talk about. I want to quickly refer to a letter which came out as a result of a discussion we had about the minimum wage the other day. I'm sure you saw it as well. Someone called Quibus sent us a letter, Kanthan, and that's why I reference you here. Quibus said that he's very annoyed about the fact that this minimum wage thing isn't a bigger issue in South Africa. He himself has been hampered by lots and lots of things, including all kinds of onerous BEE legislation. And I suppose he's just agreeing with you, but he wanted to know what your comments were on his own story.
Just remind me of his own story, Gareth.
All right, I'll read you the email.
Right,
let me read you the email.
Before you read the email, Jonny, please do stay with us, because the burning platform is also about all of our own views, as well as what we know about the world. So we'd love to have your voice here too.
Great. Thanks.
All right. So here's part of it. He says, with regard to the conversation about minimum wage, I completely agree with Kanthan. Minimum wage is one of the things that we use with bargaining councils, also just another way of minimum wage for a certain sector. See attached for electricians, and then he goes into some detail there. It's a very, very silly system. We as small businesses have to continuously work our way around these rules. With triple BEE, First, I had to make sure that I didn't go over the turnover threshold, managing our turnover to stay compliant. Now we have to manage a staff complement and stay under 50. I could have grown my business much larger if it wasn't for this. Once you go over the threshold, you are basically stuffed, as you have to increase with just such a number to be where you are and then keep things under the threshold. If they take triple BEE away, the unemployment will increase to 35%, as most surely the BEE industry creates a substantial amount of work in our growing economy, or not growing at this point. If you open up Pick and Pay across from a spa, you cannot create wealth. You only share the same pot of money. I'm really tired of these rules and everything that they make us comply with as a small enterprise. So he wants to know what your thoughts are on that.
Look, I think there's broad agreement that most of us have on the overregulation. By and large, the market tends to actually sort itself out if you remove regulations. Now, you go back a couple of years, guys, you might remember, particularly in the retail space, whenever shopping centers were put up, we would have these exclusivity agreements that would come in. So you would never have a Pick and Pay and a Checkers in the same shopping center, because as part of the conditions they would put in place to be an anchor tenant, they would actually insist that it be one or the other.
So the market takes care of that.
Well, yeah, and effectively what happened was we had the competition
commission,
yeah, which basically said, this is out of bounds, and which is why, by the way, in most shopping centers, game was never able to get a foothold. Game always had a presence outside of the regular shopping centers because of the fact that the big guys would squeeze them out. So I don't necessarily agree with this idea that, you know, if you're putting up a Pick and Pay across from a spa, that you don't create wealth, you only share the money. I think that, in fact, what you are doing there is you're having the net impact of the two competing against each other and driving prices down, which overall is what we want.
Or specialization. One of them starts to stock different stuff to the other one.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that, you know, by saying that you shouldn't have that scenario, you're actually denying agency to the shoppers. But it's absolutely right in terms of the overregulation. And Phumi, we touched on this where, you know, we said that what's going to happen is that people are just going to set up a number of businesses, each of which, you know, is below the turnover threshold, and each of which employs fewer than 50 people.
People will find a way around it.
Yes, but
it's annoying.
It's annoying because ultimately it's overregulation, and you know, just the sheer effort that you need to put in terms of keeping up with SIPC and keeping up with SARS and all of those. It's nuts.
It only works for big business, you know, but there are a couple of, and when I read the email that came through, there were a couple of, and you touch on one of them, false equivalents, I think, in this email, right? So, of course, you want a Pick and Pay and a Spa and a Checkers across from each other. For one reason, they employ 3 times as many people, right? Besides the fact that they then also drive down prices because they compete with each other. And there's a different thing, you know, I think most business owners want to see their businesses grow. Most of us want to see our businesses grow,
sure,
right? And if growing our business means growing our turnover to a particular way, there are some who look at it and go, I would rather not deal with all of the regulation and all of this stuff. I would much rather have a lifestyle business.
Right.
And so my business has to be below a particular threshold as long as it can live my life. But then there are people who do want their businesses to have 4,000 people. And I have a friend who has a business that big. And they don't think about the regulation as a hindrance. They think about how do I
they hire someone to make them compliant.
Absolutely,
that's all. They
right?
just hire somebody and they give them resources.
They say, how do I make what I want from this business is X. And so to grow the business to this particular size, that's what it is.
Well,
but I do think, and we are in agreement that one of the biggest things that our government can do for small businesses is get out of the way of small businesses. All of the forms, all of the regulations, all of those things. But we cannot then say holistically throw the baby and the water out, because some of these things, we just spoke about how the Competition Commission has actually made life better for all of us by allowing shopping centers to have competing stores in it.
The Competition Commission basically did something that the courts should have done a long time ago.
And they hadn't, but the Competition Commission did the job.
Can I move
Regulation.
us? Yeah. Can I move us onto something else that, while we've got Jonny here, I think could be quite interesting. I don't know if anybody saw the interviews with Fikile and Julius that were done by BBC Hard
I haven't
Talk.
seen the Julius.
Okay, I haven't seen the Julius.
I just saw the Fikile one. So let's talk about the Fikile one for a start, because this is where Jonny might be able to give us some sort of insight. I mean, the modern ANC, and I don't expect you to be a revisionist historian here or to try and predict the future, but the modern incarnation of the ANC is so bereft of the sort of leadership that we had at the time of Nelson Mandela, and I don't think that's a controversial thing to say either. We see Fikile Mbalula, who can't answer a single question properly. He makes an absolute mockery of the entire interview process. You almost end up feeling sorry for the interviewer, which is something that should never happen. And I keep thinking how adept Nelson Mandela was at handling the media. And he stood his ground and he said some unpopular things, which really true leaders should be able to do, should be able to say no more than just crowd please. And I even think about Winnie, who used to take huge risks with her PR, whether it was calculated or miscalculated, whether it was self-destructive, or whether it was something that she'd come up with as a plan. What do you make of the two of them and the way that they dealt with the media, and what lessons could be employed by the modern leadership of any of the political parties? Let's not just say the ANC.
I haven't seen either interview, but I've seen a lot of Fikile.
Then you've seen enough. There are no surprises.
We've seen more than we need to.
It's not like you're suddenly going to go, oh, wow, the guy's incredible. How erudite.
I mean, I think it's a question of quality.
Okay.
And the fact that he's up there in Hard Talk is a sign of the thinness of quality there.
You know what it also is for me? When you contrast those people, what Nelson Mandela had is he was a grown-up, firstly, with
very good,
but with a point of view. He had a point of view, and he was clear about what he believed in, and he was unshifting from those beliefs. Whereas Fikile, on the other hand, wants to be a celebrity. And a lot of our politicians have become that, right? They all want to be celebrities and want to be seen in a particular way.
Well, to anglicize, to anglicize his name, he's either fickle or he's facile. But to me, those are the two words that must make up some part of his character.
Gareth, I've got to take exception with something, though, because basically, I think, singling out South Africa in this regard is just basically unfair, because what we've seen globally is an overall decline in quality of leadership and the ability of people.
Joe Biden can't spit out a sentence.
Exactly. So you just do a contrast between, Obama, no matter what you might think of his policies. It's exactly what Phumi was saying. He was a grown-up.
Yeah.
And he had the ability to actually conduct a conversation in a rational basis. You might disagree with what he said. Obama's a very good example. You contrast him with modern-day successors. And again, you contrast all of the leaders that preceded Boris Johnson to Boris Johnson. And, another example of just how there's been an overall dumbing down of political leadership in the Western world. And if you look at the grown-ups right now, the grown-ups really, where are they sitting? It's Xi Jinping, it's Putin, it's Narendra Modi. Those are, look at Ruta.
Serious people.
Look at Ruta out in Kenya right now. That guy is so impressive in terms of the type of stuff that he's been talking about on the global stage right now. So he was calling out the Western world to say, we've given you a troika of African leaders to represent us. You instead want to engage with 51 of us at a time, and you want us to speak for 1.5 minutes apiece and have a dialogue with you. And it's the level of absurdity that we have right now in terms of the way in which these discussions get conducted. And let's also consider the role of the BBC in this, okay? And so we go back to the Elon Musk interview.
Right.
It's a very specific example. The interviewers are clueless. And, to Fikile Mbalula's credit in this particular case, at the point at which he hit back with a series of retorts that pointed out the fundamental hypocrisy of the West, what happens, as always with the BBC, oops, looks like we've run out of time.
Oh,
so let's move on to
something I didn't even pick that up.
Yeah, so I think, yes, we recognize that our current crop of leadership, by and large, are buffoons. And I'm very happy to say that in terms of Mr. Razmatan or Mr. Fearfok, or whatever he calls himself at any given stage. But, singling out our guys for their inherent stupidity. No, I think that, we're kind of average in terms of global stupidity right now.
Well, at least we're average at that, not below average.
I think we're below, but
you think so?
I cannot believe that we're going to miss this opportunity, because we do have a person who's just written a book, who's just gone through 3.5 years, you said, of research. Did you spend anywhere near 12.5 million?
Oh, wow. What a story, right?
I just can't. I need to understand from somebody who's just had the fresh experience.
I was surprised by the figure.
That's a lot of money for a. So, all right. So what I want to talk about here is what Phumi and I we were actually having this conversation before we started the Burning Platform this morning about how Herman Mashaba must be fairly desperate for some attention if he paid for this.
Frankly, I cannot imagine why he would have gone through that process. It's clearly an exaggerated understanding of how the book market works in South Africa. Gareth, you've published how many books?
Two.
And
Only two.
Yeah,
you're talking to Johnny. He's got about 7 out there.
Yeah, I know, but I'm using you as a very good example, because you're a person who has a fair amount of clout in terms of the overall South African landscape, not just the media landscape. But you know as well that the number of people who go out and actually buy books,
it's tiny.
It's absolutely tiny, and the possibility of
poor
that.
Johnny's shaking his head. He's like, "Oh God, 3 years."
No, it's baffling. It's baffling that he spent 12.5 million on a book. I mean, it's so obviously not worth it. It's a strange judgment.
I think you're missing the fact that when the statement came out from Mr. Mashaba, it did say an initial 12.5 million.
Good Lord, you mean there was more?
We don't know.
Wow.
We've since not spoken about that. But when I saw initial 12.5, I'm still a little bit shook.
Well, I hope you end up making even a half of that. That would be very nice, Johnny. I mean, you've certainly put in the work, and you still have your credibility intact, which we can't really say about the other.
I'll go and buy myself a new shirt.
There we go. No, that's a big story, and I think people are right to make a lot of noise about it.
And by the way, I just want to call out everyone who's actually been sharing PDFs of De Ruyter's book. We constantly go on about the fact that we despise lawlessness, and I think there's been probably about a dozen people who've sent me PDFs of this stuff. I haven't read it. If I do get down to reading it, I probably won't buy a copy, but I will borrow a copy and read it. But I think it's absolutely wrong, guys. Don't share these.
But we
PDFs.
have spoken about this on this show on countless times. South Africans say they don't like lawlessness. South Africans say they disagree with it. But when it comes down to it, they will pay the bribe. They will initiate the idea of paying the copper bribe. And when the PDFs come around, they will share the PDFs. We say it, but we don't believe it.
I think it's time we started actually walking that walk, guys. Really.
No, I mean, as an author, does this annoy you as much as it clearly annoys Kanthan? I should hope so, because this is your life. This is your bread and butter, right?
Yeah, it is. I think everybody should pay for their book.
Damn right, especially for your book. No, it's coming up. Again, if we want quality stuff, you've got to be prepared to pay for it. This is what I think people have forgotten. If you want good things, nice things, the reason that they cost money is because they're nice. If you want shit, then go for the cheap and free stuff.
So I do think one last thing on those 12.5 million. A lot of people are saying that it is his money and it is not state money. But I think what it does tell us about the handling of money from Mr. Mashaba is that he doesn't seem to have done the due diligence of what we should be paying for stuff. We spoke a little bit earlier.
And do you really
want
a guy who doesn't know the value of money running the country?
And the value of this money, right? This is also what it tells us. This little debacle tells us about this man is his view on the value of money and how it should be spent, or even the due diligence of spending money on particular things. So yeah, it is his money. And now that we're being told it's a loan, I wonder if he did the fika of whether the man is going to be able to pay him back. Or is there something else going on there that we have not yet started thinking about?
Well, I mean, also, poor old Herman, he has to find a way of becoming relevant that doesn't cut down his fortune by 12.5 million.
He had the
rand.
best opportunity to be relevant. You know, he was actually an up-and-coming star in the DA. He was mayor of Johannesburg, and he completely fucked it up.
That's exactly right.
And, you know, I was so sorry that I wasted my vote on him, really.
Well, let me ask you this quickly when we talk about waste. Wastewater has killed 17 people in Hammanskraal and Pretoria. It's also a big story this week. Of course, it won't last very long as a big story. By next week, this time, it'll be forgotten. But this is another example of incompetence and a lack of diligence, maintenance, care, attention. Clearly, the powers that be, whether they're at municipal level, provincial level, or at national level, are not really interested in the welfare of average South Africans. They're interested in whatever they can get out of the deal themselves. This is the kind of venality that we have become used to in South Africa.
Well, there's no consequences, Gareth. No one is going to go to jail.
No.
Yeah, and no one is going to be fined. And it's part of a global phenomenon. I don't know if you guys have been following the story about the eye drops in the US that were released, the contaminated eye drops.
No.
People have gone blind and people have died as a direct result of bacterial infections in eye drops because of the fact that the company manufacturing the eye drops. I tweeted the story last week. People have lost their eyesight. They have died as a result of the infections. No one is going to go to jail as a direct result of this. Shout out to the Chinese in this regard. At the point at which someone tried to take baby formula and adulterate it and people end up dying, the person was promptly executed.
Yeah, that's right.
Which is the way it should be happening. But we don't have consequences. So this goes back to our other discussion, which is go off grid. So, you need to manage your own water supply. You need to take responsibility for the stuff yourself. Because if you are trusting the state to do this stuff, it's not going to come. And we're good at that as South Africans. I think that we're better equipped than the rest of the world to actually sort out this stuff for ourselves.
But the majority of South Africans are going to have to trust the state, in perpetuity for water. And for me, the Kara story is just terrible. It's a very, very basic function that's gone wrong. For some reason, for me, it's the worst story of the last few months. It absolutely shouldn't be happening. It's the most simple.
No, but we've been saying this is going to happen for the longest time.
So, because we've got like 3 minutes left in the show, and because we are talking about lawlessness, Jonny, I'm going to give you a chance to talk about your other book. I don't know if it's still available in bookstores, about the relationship of South Africans and the police.
Thin Blue.
Yes.
So that was a long, long time ago. In 2005, 6, 7, I went on patrols with South African police. And one of the things I found was how much policing only works when people consent to be policed. And if they don't trust the police, they don't consent. And so you have a patrol begins with a policing plan. This is where the crime hotspots are. This is the place you should be. The police avoided those spots. They tried to stay away. They didn't want to be among people. They didn't want to be among crowds because they'd experience hostility. So it was a real jolt that if police...
How long ago did you write that book?
It was published, I think, in 2007 or 8.
So clearly things have got a lot worse since then, right?
Absolutely.
Not better.
Absolutely.
And that consent to be policed and that kind of contract between society and the police.
But it comes from trust, Gareth. And if you don't trust the cops,
right?
then why
exactly.
would you do so?
I mean, a lot of this is self-inflicted harm. It's not just that the public have become disenchanted with the police. It's that we've seen over and over again that lack of accountability that you spoke about just a second ago, right? Yeah, I mean, so what's the next project for you? Because you've got so many plates spinning and you've got so many things that you could write about. And this country's, as we said about Nelson and Winnie, rich material.
Well, the next project goes way back into the 19th century. It's about the homosexuality of Cecil John Rhodes. It's the connection between his private life and his life as an imperialist.
Wow. Is there enough material for you to be able to?
I believe that there is.
Really, this is going to be very exciting.
Plenty of
what
material.
an amazing! That's a mic drop moment where we can wait for the next book.
You're going to have to come back for blind history on that.
Unbelievable.
I'd love to.
Well, again, thank you, Jonny. Kanthan, Phumi, we will see you next Thursday for more of the Burning Platform.
I'm hoping that there's a default in the US, guys. Just so you know.
Are you hoping for that?
Yeah. Because what happens is when the bond market crashes, the stocks go up. And remember that I'm invested in US stocks.
There we go. All right. Very good.
I don't think it'll happen.
A default's on Kanthan's menu for next week. We hope no more cholera. That's all I'm hoping for next week. Have an awesome day, everybody. We will see you on tomorrow's show at 6.